Sometimes the brightest light flickers first in the darkest corners of a room no one cares about. The garage of the Langford estate was never meant to be a place of wonder. It was wide, cold, and practical, built to house polished cars that gleamed like mirrors, their engines silent until called upon. The air always smelled faintly of gasoline and steel, mixed with the soft hum of fluorescent bulbs that flickered lazily above. But in one forgotten corner of that garage, beneath a canvas sheet spotted with grease, sat a machine no one had cared to fix. It was a humanoid robot, once paraded at an investor dinner as a symbol of innovation, now discarded when it failed to perform. The engineers had written it off as a sunk cost, a failed prototype too temperamental to salvage. The billionaire who owned it had turned his attention to more profitable ventures, and his staff had been ordered not to touch it again. Yet tonight, as the estate lay draped in silence, someone did touch it. A boy. He was small for his age, barely 13, with dark hair that refused to stay combed and hands perpetually stained from tinkering with whatever scraps he could find. His shirt was worn thin at the elbows, the fabric faded from too many washes, and his sneakers carried holes at the toes where skin met the night air. He was the chauffeur's son, neither guest nor servant, belonging to the estate only by accident of blood and circumstance. The boy's name was Daniel. He crouched in front of the broken robot, a screwdriver far too large for his hand clutched like a sword. One knee pressed into the concrete floor, he leaned close, his breath fogging against the cold casing of the machine. He had already removed a panel, exposing a tangle of wires and circuits that looked chaotic to most eyes. To him, it was a puzzle waiting to speak. "Why would they give up on you?" Daniel whispered. His voice was so low that only the shadows seemed to hear. "You're not broken. You're just waiting for someone to listen." No one had taught him robotics. No one had ever sat him down and explained engineering principles or circuitry design. What he knew came from hours of watching mechanics fix cars in his father's garage, from sneaking old instruction manuals out of dumpsters, from piecing together discarded radios until they hummed again. Machines made sense to him in ways people didn't. People were full of contradictions and sharp edges. Machines had a rhythm. If you listened closely, they told you exactly what they needed. He placed the screwdriver aside and reached in with bare fingers, brushing against the wires as though feeling for a pulse. He closed his eyes, letting his fingertips trace the pathways. Where others saw a mess, he felt a map. There was warmth in one wire where none should be, a faint vibration where silence should have lived. "There you are," he murmured, smiling slightly. With a deftness that belied his age, Daniel began working. He twisted one connection tighter, uncoiled another, and nudged a microchip back into alignment. He worked slowly, reverently, as though each piece carried a secret waiting to be revealed. The minutes stretched into an hour, but time didn't matter. The world outside, the mansion with its glittering chandeliers, the wealthy guests who saw his father only when they needed a driver, had no claim on him here. This corner of the garage belonged to him and the machine alone. A bead of sweat slid down his temple. He wiped it with the back of his hand, leaving a streak of grease across his face. His stomach growled faintly. He had skipped dinner again, too distracted by the promise of this broken robot. But he ignored it. Hunger was temporary. The chance to awaken something forgotten was rare. At last, he adjusted a final wire and sat back on his heels. He exhaled slowly, his breath trembling. Then, hesitantly, he pressed the power switch. For a moment, nothing. Only the stillness of the garage, the faint creak of metal contracting in the cool night. Then, a faint whir. The robot's eyes flickered, not fully alive, but struggling toward light. Daniel leaned forward, his heart thudding like a drum. The machine shuddered once, its arm twitching weakly before falling still again. It wasn't a triumph yet, but it was more than what had existed before. And to Daniel, that tiny flicker was everything. He grinned, teeth flashing white in the dim glow of the bulbs above. See? You just needed someone to believe you could wake up. But he wasn't alone. Across the garage, a tall shadow had appeared in the doorway, framed by the glow of the corridor lights. The figure was silent, unmoving, watching. The boy was too focused on his creation to notice, too caught in the magic of coaxing life from metal and wires. The man in the doorway was Victor Langford. Langford was not the kind of billionaire who liked to be surprised. Every detail of his estate, every venture of his empire, was designed to move under his control. He believed in efficiency, in discipline, in calculated risk. But tonight, as he prepared to retire from his study, he had taken a detour through the garage, a habit born from sleepless nights and restless thoughts. He had expected silence. Instead, he found a child hunched over a corpse of steel, coaxing it back to life with nothing more than bare hands and stubborn will. Victor did not speak. He crossed his arms over his chest, his sharp suit catching the fluorescent glow, and simply watched. He wanted to see how far the boy would go without knowing he was observed. Daniel, oblivious, pressed the switch again. He adjusted another wire, whispered words of encouragement as though the machine could hear, and when the robot's eyes flickered once more, brighter this time, Victor felt something stir inside him he had not felt in years. Curiosity. Here was no ordinary tinkering, no random child's play. This was precision, instinct, a mind seeing order where others saw failure. He recognized the expression on the boy's face, the same look his top engineers wore when standing on the edge of breakthrough. For the first time in decades, Victor Langford did not know what to say. The silence between them grew heavy until Daniel finally sensed it. He stiffened, the screwdriver slipping from his hand and clattering against the floor. He turned slowly, his wide eyes reflecting fear. And there he saw him, the master of the estate, the billionaire who paid his father's wages, the man whose footsteps echoed like judgment. Daniel's lips parted, but no words came. His throat felt dry, his body frozen. He thought of his father, who always warned him, "Don't draw attention, keep your head down, this house isn't ours." I was just..." Daniel stammered, scrambling to explain. Victor raised a hand, silencing him without a word. He stepped closer, the sound of his shoes deliberate against the concrete floor. His gaze swept over the exposed robot, the boy's trembling hands, the half-flickering light in the machine's eyes. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, even. "Who taught you to do this?" Daniel swallowed. "No one, sir. I just tried." Victor studied him for a long moment, then looked back at the machine. He saw the adjustments, the cleaned connections, the logic of the boy's changes. None of this was accidental. "You tried," Victor repeated softly, "and it almost worked." Daniel lowered his eyes, bracing for anger. He expected to be scolded, dragged out, forbidden ever to come near this garage again. But no anger came. Instead, Victor Langford simply stood there watching the boy, weighing something unseen. Behind his stern expression, gears were turning, questions, calculations, the faint spark of wonder he thought long dead. The boy had given a broken thing a second breath, and Victor Langford, billionaire and builder of empires, found himself wondering, had he just stumbled upon something the world had overlooked? The garage held its breath, and in that silence, a new story began. The garage was still, but Daniel's heartbeat thundered so loud he thought it must echo against the steel beams above. He had been caught. That much was certain. The shadow of Victor Langford stretched across the concrete floor like the wing of some vast bird, long and unyielding. The boy's first instinct was fear. Fear of punishment, of being told he had no right to touch what didn't belong to him. His father's warnings rushed back in fragments. Keep your hands clean. Don't meddle with their things. We live by their rules, not ours. Yet Victor did not shout. He did not call for guards or for Daniel's father. He only studied him, as one might study a cipher carved into stone. Strange, unexpected, worth deciphering. Do you know what this machine is? Victor's voice was low, measured. It was not the voice of anger, but of inquiry. Daniel swallowed hard. He nodded faintly, unsure if words would betray him. It's a prototype, a humanoid assistant robot, model LX9. It was designed to mimic human gestures and perform complex manual tasks. The billionaire raised an eyebrow. And how do you know that? Daniel hesitated, then spoke with a quiet honesty. I listened. When the engineers came months ago, they talked while they worked. I remembered. Victor tilted his head, intrigued despite himself. Few adults had retained the details of that model after it failed, and here stood a boy, repeating its designation like a prayer. You've been watching, Victor said slowly. Yes, sir, Daniel admitted. His gaze dropped to the floor. But I didn't mean any harm. I just wanted to see if it could move again. Victor let the silence stretch, testing him, measuring the weight of his fear against the pull of his curiosity. At last he stepped closer, his shoes striking the floor with the precision of a clock. He stopped beside the robot, its casing still open like a wound half-stitched, wires glimmering under the harsh light. You adjusted these connections, Victor observed, pointing with one finger. That was no guess. Daniel's breath caught. It looked wrong. The current was feeding backward. I just followed the path. Followed the path, Victor repeated, as though tasting the words. Then, after a pause, show me. Daniel blinked. Sir? Show me what you see. The boy's fingers trembled. He had expected reprimand, not invitation. His instincts screamed caution, but the machine called louder. Slowly, he reached forward, brushing the wires again. He spoke as he worked, words spilling like water from a hidden spring. This circuit, see here, it's overheating because the grounding loop wasn't insulated properly. And this servo motor, it isn't aligned with the central joint. The engineers kept replacing the motor, but the problem was this. He tapped lightly on a misaligned hinge, then adjusted it with careful precision. It just needs balance. Victor watched in silence, his sharp eyes following every movement. The boy spoke without arrogance, without even realizing the depth of what he revealed. It was as if the machine whispered to him, and he merely translated its language. Finally, Daniel sat back, breathless. Try now, he whispered, though the words weren't meant for Victor. They were meant for the robot. Victor reached forward and pressed the power switch. For a moment, nothing. Then, with a slow tremor, the robot's hand lifted an inch off the floor. The fingers twitched, weak but undeniably alive. Its eyes glowed faintly blue before dimming again. Daniel gasped. Victor narrowed his gaze. It responds, Victor said. Yes, Daniel whispered. His face lit up with a mixture of relief and wonder. It's not gone. It just needed the right touch. Victor did not answer immediately. He was weighing not the machine's revival, but the boy himself. In all his years, he had learned that genius rarely came dressed in polish. It came ragged, inconvenient, clothed in hands that the world dismissed. But genius, true genius, could never be mistaken once it revealed itself. He looked at Daniel. Who are you really, boy? The question cut deeper than Daniel expected. Who was he? Just the chauffeur's son? just a shadow trailing behind his father's long work hours, too poor for private schools, too invisible for anyone to ask his dreams. But now, with the weight of the billionaire's gaze upon him, the answer felt too small. "I'm Daniel," he said softly. "That's all." Victor studied him for another long moment. Then, unexpectedly, he gave a short laugh, low, sharp, not unkind, but edged with disbelief. "All?" His eyes flicked toward the robot, still faintly humming. "Daniel, you are many things, but all is not one of them." The words struck Daniel like a strange blessing, though he barely understood them. At that moment, the sound of footsteps echoed from the far side of the garage. Daniel's father appeared, his cap pulled low. Fatigue etched across his face from the long day's drive. When he saw the scene before him, his son kneeling by the open robot, Victor Langford standing over them, his face drained of color. "Sir," the chauffeur stammered, I apologize. He shouldn't be here. Daniel, get up, now!" Daniel scrambled to his feet, heart pounding. His father's eyes were wide with fear. To be caught like this, meddling where they didn't belong, it could cost them everything. But Victor raised a hand, silencing the man. "Leave him." "Sir?" "Your boy has done what your engineers could not," Victor said evenly. "He woke the machine." The chauffeur froze, disbelief and fear warring in his expression. He dared not speak against his employer, but his gaze flicked desperately to his son, as though begging him to understand the danger. Victor, however, did not notice, or perhaps he did, and simply did not care. His focus remained on Daniel, sharp as a blade. "You will come with me tomorrow," Victor said. "There is something I want to see." Daniel's throat went dry. He nodded faintly, unable to form words. His father began to protest, but one look from Victor silenced him. The billionaire turned, his coat brushing the air like a closing curtain, and walked out of the garage without another word. The silence he left behind was heavier than his presence. Daniel stood frozen, his father gripping his shoulder so tight it hurt. "What have you done, boy?" the man whispered, voice trembling. Daniel had no answer. He only knew that something had shifted tonight, something larger than himself, larger than his father's fears. For the first time in his life, someone powerful had seen him not as a shadow, but as light. And though Daniel did not yet understand the cost, he felt a strange fire kindling in his chest. The midnight encounter was over. But the dawn it awakened had only just begun. Morning sunlight spilled through the tall windows of the Langford estate, washing the marble floors in gold. Daniel had not slept. His mind replayed the events of the night again and again. The flicker in the robot's eyes, the billionaire's measured gaze, the command to return. His father had muttered warnings all through breakfast, words weighted with fear. "Keep quiet. Don't get involved. The less he notices you, the safer you are." But it was too late. Victor Langford had noticed. Daniel now stood outside the research wing of the mansion, a place he had only glimpsed from a distance. The double doors loomed ahead, guarded not by men, but by technology, scanners, locks, silent machines designed to keep out the curious. Yet when the doors opened with a soft hiss, it was not an engineer or scientist who stepped through first. It was him, the chauffeur's son. Inside, the room was alive with motion. Engineers in crisp white coats moved between glowing consoles. Holographic diagrams floated in the air, showing schematics of limbs, circuits, entire humanoid forms reduced to patterns of light. The hum of machines filled the air, steady as a heartbeat. And then there was Victor, already at the center, his presence commanding the space like gravity itself. He gestured toward Daniel with the authority of one accustomed to being obeyed. "This," he announced to his startled staff, "is the boy I mentioned." A murmur rippled through the room. Disbelief, amusement, irritation. A child among them was an insult to their credentials. One man, a tall engineer with graying temples, crossed his arms. "With respect, sir," the man said, "we don't have time for distractions. The LX-9 project is beyond repair. We've all agreed." Victor cut him off with a single look. "Agreed? No. You decided to abandon it. Last night, this boy proved otherwise." The silence that followed was heavy, brittle. Daniel felt every eye on him, each glance sharp as a blade. His cheeks burned. He wished he could shrink into the floor, but Victor's gaze held him steady. "Show them," Victor said. Daniel's heart raced. He stepped hesitantly toward the table where the robot lay, its body half covered in sheets, the evidence of failure. He felt the weight of the engineer's skepticism pressing down on him. Their faces said what their lips dared not. "You don't belong here. You'll embarrass yourself." His hands trembled as he touched the wires. Yet the moment his fingers brushed the circuits, the trembling stilled. Machines never judged. They only spoke truth. "This motor here," Daniel began softly, pointing to the robot's shoulder joint. "It isn't defective. The problem is the torque distribution. You tried reinforcing it, but that only made it worse." The engineers leaned in despite themselves. "If you shift the weight here," Daniel adjusted a small component with delicate precision, "the strain spreads evenly, like balance in a body, like how a person leans forward before running." One of the younger engineers frowned, glancing at the schematic. "He's right," she muttered, almost against her will. Daniel continued, his voice gaining strength. "And this circuit, you thought it shorted, but it only needed insulation. I fixed it last night." He reconnected 2 wires, then stepped back, his chest rising and falling quickly. Victor nodded once. "Power it on." A technician hesitated, then pressed the switch. The room held its breath. The robot stirred, its arm lifted, fingers curling with deliberate slowness. Its torso shifted, joints clicking softly as though awakening from a long sleep. For the first time since its abandonment, the LX-9 prototype moved with purpose. Gasps broke the silence. The graying engineer shook his head in disbelief. "Impossible," he whispered. Victor's lips curved into the faintest of smiles. "Not impossible. Overlooked." Daniel stared at the machine, awe and joy mingling in his eyes. It was alive again, not fully, not perfectly, but undeniably alive. And he had done it. He, the boy who was supposed to stay invisible. But the awe in the room quickly curdled into something else. Jealousy, fear, resentment. The older engineer stepped forward, his jaw tight. "So the boy happened upon a correction. A fluke. That doesn't make him an engineer." Victor's gaze sharpened. "It makes him more than you, who left it for dead." The man flushed, but said nothing. The others shifted uneasily. Daniel's father stood in the doorway, cap in hand, his face pale with worry. He had been summoned as driver, but now bore witness to something he did not want. His son stepping into a world too dangerous for dreamers. He caught Daniel's eye and shook his head slightly, a silent plea. "Don't go further. Don't rise too high. The fall will break you." But Daniel could not retreat. Not now. The fire inside him had been seen. Victor placed a hand on the boy's shoulder. "You have talent, Daniel, a rare kind. Machines speak to you, don't they?" Daniel nodded faintly, almost ashamed. I just feel them. I can tell when something's wrong, like listening to a song out of tune." The billionaire studied him, and in his eyes gleamed not pity, not curiosity, but recognition. The hidden talent was no longer hidden, and for Daniel, the world would never be the same again. The robot's arm had barely lowered when the weight of silence pressed down on the room. For a fleeting moment, Daniel had felt the purest triumph of his short life. The machine had moved. It had listened. He had woken it from death with nothing but instinct and a pair of trembling hands. But the faces staring back at him were not softened by wonder. They were carved in skepticism, some in open disdain. The engineers, veterans of degrees and patents, refused to yield pride to a boy in threadbare sneakers. His father's eyes held fear, Victor Langford's gaze held calculation, and somewhere deep in Daniel's chest burned both hope and dread. Victor broke the silence first. His voice was calm, almost conversational. Daniel, tell me. What happens to a servo motor when it carries more torque than its frame allows? The boy blinked. His mind, so sharp with intuition, stumbled at the formality of the question. It was the language of engineers, the sort of thing professors etched on chalkboards. Yet the answer came to him not in formulas, but in images. It shakes, Daniel said softly, like a man carrying a load too heavy. First his arms strain, then his legs wobble, then his back bends, until something breaks. The room murmured. Victor tilted his head, intrigued. And what prevents the break? Victor pressed. Daniel hesitated, then gestured toward the robot's frame. Balance. You spread the weight across the joints, or you give it pause, let it rest between movements so the strain doesn't pile up all at once. One of the younger engineers whispered, "That's load distribution and interval sequencing." The older, graying engineer scoffed. "He doesn't even know the terms. He talks like a child with metaphors." Victor's gaze flicked to him, cold and sharp. "And yet the machine obeyed him, not you." The man fell silent. Victor turned back to Daniel. "Second question. If the power current runs backward, what happens to the system?" Daniel closed his eyes. He pictured the wires beneath his fingertips, the hum of misaligned energy. He imagined a river flowing uphill, pressure building, the banks straining until they burst. "It overheats," he said quietly. "It burns itself, like a heart pumping the wrong way. It tries, but it kills instead of giving life." A hush fell. The boy spoke not in formulas, but in truths anyone could see once named. He was building bridges between machine and flesh, body and metal. Victor's lips curved faintly. "You speak in pictures." Daniel's shoulders hunched, as if ashamed. "It's the only way I understand." "It is the only way anyone truly understands," Victor countered. The boy's father shifted uneasily in the doorway, torn between pride and terror. He knew too well that men like Victor Langford did not notice boys like Daniel unless they wanted something, and once they wanted, they never let go. Victor paced slowly around the table, his hands clasped behind his back. The air in the room grew taut with expectation. The billionaire had not asked such questions in years, not to his board, not to his engineers. His voice was measured, but those who knew him could sense it. Victor Langford was testing. "Third question," he said at last. He stopped directly across from Daniel, his eyes sharp. "What is the purpose of a machine?" The words struck heavier than the others. Daniel's brow furrowed. He felt every gaze press into him, waiting, ready to laugh if he faltered. He searched for the answer they wanted, the technical, clinical one. But his heart resisted. Finally, he whispered, "To help." The graying engineer barked a laugh. "Ridiculous! A machine's purpose is efficiency, output, utility." But Daniel shook his head, his voice firmer now. "No, efficiency is how it helps. But the purpose is help. To carry weight we cannot. To remember what we forget. to move where we are too weak. Otherwise, what's the point of building them at all? The room fell silent. Victor Langford stood utterly still. His expression betrayed nothing, yet behind his eyes something flickered. Memory, perhaps, of why he had built his empire to begin with, before profit clouded vision. Slowly, he nodded. You may not know the language of engineers, Daniel, but you know the truth. The engineers shifted uncomfortably, some outraged, others unsettled. They saw their years of learning dismissed in favor of a boy's metaphors. Yet they could not deny what they had witnessed. The machine stirred under his touch, and his words rang with clarity they themselves had forgotten. Victor stepped closer to Daniel. His voice dropped lower, intimate, as though spoken only between them. Machines are mirrors, boy. They show us what we are. You see that? That is your gift. Daniel's chest swelled with something he could not name. It was not pride. He was too wary for that. It was not safety. His father's worried gaze told him no safety lay here. It was possibility. The fragile, dangerous kind that could open worlds or destroy them. Victor turned to his staff, his decision already made. From this day he observes here. No more protests. He has seen what you have not. The older engineer bristled. Sir, with all respect, this is reckless. A child in this lab? We have standards, protocols. Standards? Victor cut in, his voice rising for the first time. Standards are what buried that machine under dust. This boy brought it to life. The protest died. Victor faced Daniel once more. You will return here tomorrow, and the day after, until I say otherwise. Daniel's father stepped forward at last, his voice shaking. Sir, please, he's just a boy. He has school. Victor silenced him with a glance. Your son has more to learn here than in any classroom. Do not stand in his way. The chauffeur's shoulders slumped. He could not defy the man who paid his wages, who could end his livelihood with a single word. He looked at Daniel, his eyes filled with warning and sorrow. But Daniel only stood frozen, his small hands curled into fists at his sides. He had been tested. He had answered. And though fear coiled tight in his chest, a new flame had been lit. The first question had not ended with an answer. It had ended with a door opening. A door Daniel could not close again, no matter how much he longed for safety. In the quiet hum of the lab, amid the tension of jealous engineers and the unyielding gaze of Victor Langford, a boy had stepped beyond the shadow of his father's warnings, and for the first time he realized he could never return to invisibility. The following evening, the mansion seemed larger than ever. Daniel walked beside his father through the marble corridors, their footsteps echoing in the stillness. His father's hand pressed firmly on his shoulder, not as comfort, but as a warning. Don't forget who you are. Don't forget where you don't belong. But Daniel could not forget what had happened in the laboratory. The robot stirring under his touch, the questions Victor Langford had asked, the answers that had tumbled from his heart. He had not dreamed it. He had not imagined the billionaire's voice declaring, "He will return here tomorrow." Now tomorrow had come. The double doors of the research wing opened again, and Daniel felt the same rush of awe and dread. The holograms floated in the air like ghosts of invention. The engineers turned their heads sharply, their eyes narrowing with disapproval. They had not grown warmer overnight. Victor Langford stood at the far end of the room, his back straight, his silver hair catching the light. He was not a man to waste words, and yet when he saw Daniel enter, a thin smile touched his lips. Welcome back, Daniel. The boy swallowed hard, his throat dry. Thank you, sir. Sir, Victor corrected gently, is for those who serve. Tonight you do not serve. Tonight, you observe. The words carried weight heavier than their sound. Observe. Not as a servant's son, not as a trespasser, but as one who had been invited. Victor motioned toward a long table where the LX-9 prototype lay. You woke at once. Now you will watch as we attempt more. You will learn what we see, and I will learn what you see. That is our bargain. Daniel's heart thudded. Bargain. He had not realized he had entered one, but now it bound him all the same. The engineers gathered, their faces tight with resentment. One of them, a woman with sharp glasses and an even sharper tone, crossed her arms. Mr. Langford, this is highly irregular. We are professionals. He is a child. If word of this leaks... Victor silenced her with a look. Word will not leak, and if it does, let them write that a boy accomplished what professionals could not. The silence that followed was bitter. Daniel felt the heat of their stares, but Victor's presence shielded him, like a fortress of authority none dared breach. Begin, Victor commanded. The team moved reluctantly, powering up the consoles. Data streamed across the holograms, torque measurements, energy consumption, balance algorithms. Daniel's eyes darted over the glowing lines. He didn't understand the formulas, not as they wrote them. But he felt the rhythm. Where they saw columns of numbers, he saw the sway of a body trying to walk, the heartbeat of a machine trying to live. The robot's head lifted slowly, its sensors blinking. A joint whined as it tried to raise its leg. See? One engineer said quickly. The actuator is still defective. It won't hold. Daniel frowned. It's not the actuator. It's the delay. You're telling the leg to move before the core stabilizes, like asking someone to stand before they've caught their breath. The room stiffened. Victor looked at him sharply. Explain. Daniel hesitated, then pointed to the hologram. Here, the timing's wrong. If you wait half a second longer, the balance shifts evenly. The leg won't collapse. The lead engineer scoffed. Ridiculous. We've tested thousands of sequences. Not this one, Daniel interrupted. Surprising even himself. His cheeks burned, but his eyes stayed fixed on the glowing lines. You tested the logic, not the rhythm. Victor raised a hand. Run it. The engineer bristled. Sir, run it. With tight lips, the woman adjusted the program. The robot's leg lifted again. This time, its body steadied. The whine softened. The leg locked into place with a fluidity it had never shown before. Gasps filled the room. Daniel let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. His lips curved into the smallest of smiles. Victor's eyes gleamed. Remarkable. The engineers exchanged uneasy glances. They could not deny what they had just witnessed, but denial was easier than surrender, and already whispers of dismissal began. A lucky guess, a fluke, intuition without science. Victor ignored them. He stepped forward and placed a hand on Daniel's shoulder. Do you know what you've done? Daniel shook his head. You've seen what others missed. You've bridged logic with instinct. That is genius, boy. Genius not learned, but born. Daniel's heart pounded. He wanted to believe it, wanted to let those words wrap around him like a cloak. But he could feel the sharp eyes of the engineers digging into his skin, their jealousy like a blade at his back. Victor straightened, addressing the room. From this day, Daniel has access to the lab. He will observe all sessions. He will speak when he chooses. His insight is not to be silenced. The statement fell like a hammer. The engineers' faces tightened, but no one dared contradict him. Only Daniel's father, still waiting in the shadows, dared to whisper, Sir, please. He is too young. Victor turned. His voice softened, though it carried the weight of command. Youth is no weakness. It is the well from which vision springs. Your son will stay. The chauffeur's face fell, torn between fear and helpless pride. He could not refuse the man who held his livelihood. But he knew, oh, he knew, that this path would not end quietly. Victor looked back at Daniel. Do you accept my invitation, boy? To walk where others have barred you? To see what others have refused you? Daniel's throat tightened. He thought of his father's warnings, of the contempt in the engineer's eyes. He thought of the robot lifting its leg, obeying his rhythm. He thought of the fire inside him that would not go out. Yes, he whispered. Then louder. Yes, I accept. Victor nodded once, satisfied. Then it begins. The engineers dispersed, but their silence was heavy, dangerous. Daniel could feel it pressing at his back, even as he stood beside Victor. The invitation had been given. It had been accepted. But in the shadows of the lab, unseen forces were already conspiring. Because when a boy from nowhere is lifted into the light, those who live in the light will do anything to push him back into the dark. The laboratory buzzed with unusual energy that evening. The LX-9 prototype, which had lain silent for months, now stood upright on its support frame. Its limbs flexed with halting precision, guided by programs the engineers had spent the day refining. Investors had been promised a demonstration by the end of the week, and Victor Langford had made it clear, failure was not an option. Daniel stood off to the side, his hands clasped tightly behind his back. He was not supposed to touch anything tonight. Victor had said simply, watch, learn, speak only when you must. The boy obeyed, though every muscle in his body hummed with the need to act. He could see details the others missed, the subtle lag between the robot's shoulder and elbow, the faint strain in the servos when it turned its head. To him, it was like listening to an orchestra slightly out of tune. The music was there, but the discord made his bones ache. The lead engineer, Dr. Collins, the one with the graying temples and the sharp tongue, stood at the console, issuing commands. His jaw was set with determination, but his eyes flicked toward Daniel every so often with thinly veiled contempt. Activating full sequence, Collins announced. Mobility, balance, and voice recognition. The robot stirred. Its head turned, sensors blinking. Slowly, it took a step forward. The room collectively held its breath. One step, then another. Its arms rose in a gesture almost human. Applause rippled among the engineers. Relief poured from their faces. At last, their months of work seemed vindicated. But Daniel's stomach twisted. Something was wrong. He could feel it in the rhythm. The robot lifted its right leg and faltered. The whine of the servo grew sharp, urgent. Its torso lurched sideways. Warnings flashed across the holographic display, but too late. The machine collapsed forward, crashing to the floor with a thunderous clang. Sparks shot from its shoulder joint. The applause died instantly. "Shut it down!" Collins barked. Technicians scrambled, yanking cables. The robot twitched once more before falling still, smoke curling faintly from its casing. The acrid smell of burnt insulation filled the room. Silence. Heavy, accusing. Collins slammed his hand against the console. "We were seconds from a clean sequence! Seconds!" His eyes darted to Victor, desperate to salvage pride. "It was a minor fault, easily correctable. The actuator gave way, nothing more." Daniel's voice rose before he could stop himself. "No." Every head turned. The boy froze, his chest tight, but the words had already escaped. Victor's gaze sharpened. "Explain." Daniel stepped forward hesitantly, his heart pounding. He knelt beside the fallen robot, running his fingertips along the scorched wires. He closed his eyes, listening. not with ears, but with instinct. He traced the path in his mind, energy flowing backward, balance lost before the leg had even lifted. It wasn't the actuator, he said quietly. The error started before the leg moved. The timing between the core and the servo was wrong. It was forced to carry weight before the center was ready. The stress didn't just break the actuator, it broke the sequence itself. Collins scoffed. Nonsense. That's speculation. He doesn't understand the code. Daniel looked up, his face pale but steady. I don't need the code, I felt it. The machine was trying to stand, but you pushed it too soon, like making someone run before they've learned to walk. The words hung in the air. Simple. Unscientific. Yet undeniable. Victor stepped forward, his eyes locked on the boy. Can you prove it? Daniel swallowed. His father's warnings echoed in his head. Stay invisible. Don't rise too high. But the fire in his chest burned hotter. He could not stay silent, not when he knew. Yes, he whispered. Give me the sequence. The room erupted in protest. This is absurd, Collins shouted. He's a child. We're dealing with millions in research, not toys for him to play with. Victor raised a hand. The protests died. His voice was calm, but it carried the weight of steel. Give him the sequence. Collins clenched his jaw, fury etched into every line of his face, but he obeyed. He stepped aside from the console, his movements stiff, his pride bleeding. Daniel climbed onto the stool, his legs barely reaching the floor. He scanned the glowing code on the screen, incomprehensible symbols and commands scrolling endlessly. To the engineers, it was their language, their domain. To him, it was noise. But within the noise, he searched for rhythm. He closed his eyes. He pictured the robot rising, the balance shifting from one leg to the other. He listened to the invisible beat, and then he pointed. Here, he said softly. Delay this command. Half a second. Collins nearly exploded. Half a second? Do you realize the complexity of synchronization? You can't just run it, Victor ordered. Reluctantly, the adjustment was made. The robot powered on again, its sensors blinking back to life. Slowly, cautiously, it rose. It lifted its leg, paused, then stepped forward. No falter, no collapse. Another step, then another. Its balance held. The room erupted in disbelief. Victor's eyes gleamed with something Daniel could not name. Triumph, perhaps, or vindication. The boy was right. Daniel exhaled, relief flooding him. He smiled faintly, but the moment was short-lived. Collins slammed the console shut. This is dangerous. You're undermining years of research for the word of a child. He doesn't understand the science. He guesses, and you treat it as gospel. If this continues, you'll turn the project into a circus. Victor's gaze was icy. And yet the circus walks while your science collapsed on the floor. The words cut like a blade. Collins's face reddened, his pride wounded beyond repair. He looked at Daniel with a hatred the boy could feel like heat against his skin. Daniel shivered, realizing that he had not just solved a problem, he had made an enemy. Victor, however, seemed unfazed. He placed a hand on Daniel's shoulder. You see what they cannot. That is why you are here. The boy's father, silent until now, stepped forward. His voice trembling. Sir, please. He's only a boy. He doesn't belong in the middle of this. Victor's eyes did not leave Daniel's. Belonging is not given. It is taken. And he has taken it. The room was tense, the air thick with resentment and awe. Daniel felt small, his chest tight, but he also felt something else. Certainty. The impossible error had revealed itself to him alone. And though the engineers hated him for it, though his father feared for him, though danger now lurked in every glance cast his way, Daniel knew one truth that nothing could erase. He had listened to the machine, and it had answered. In the days that followed, the research wing of the Langford estate became a battlefield, not of shouted words or open defiance, but of glances, silences, and whispers carried in the sterile air of the lab. Daniel could feel it as soon as he stepped inside, the shift in temperature, the prickling awareness of eyes on him. He was no longer just the chauffeur's son who lingered in corners. He was the boy who had awakened a dead machine. The boy who had solved the impossible error with a single adjustment that none of the engineers had seen. And that made him dangerous. Victor Langford continued to bring him into the lab each evening. "Observe," he would say. "Speak when you see." It was an instruction and a challenge, a command wrapped in opportunity. Victor never coddled him, never softened his words. Yet Daniel understood. The billionaire had placed him at the center of something larger than he could yet comprehend. The engineers, however, saw something else entirely. To them, Daniel was a threat, a living reminder of their failure, a child whose very presence questioned their years of education, their salaries, their pride. Dr. Collins, especially, could not hide his disdain. The man's jaw tightened whenever Daniel spoke, his lips pressing into a thin line. Others followed his lead. They would exchange whispers Daniel wasn't meant to hear, but his ears, sharp from a lifetime of listening in silence, caught fragments. A fluke. Nothing more. "Langford is blinded by novelty. We'll lose funding if this boy keeps meddling." At first, Daniel tried to shrink back, to stay invisible as his father had always urged. He spoke less, offered his observations only when Victor demanded them. But machines did not allow him to remain silent. He saw their rhythm, felt their imbalance, and the words rose unbidden. One night, as the LX-9 prototype attempted to lift a small box from the floor, Daniel blurted out, "The grip strength is uneven. It's pinching on one side. Shift the pressure across both digits." The robot adjusted clumsily, then succeeded. Victor nodded approvingly. "Good." But Collins's glare burned hotter than ever. That evening, Daniel overheard him in the corridor outside the lab, his voice low and furious as he spoke to two younger engineers. "This boy is no genius," Collins hissed. "He's an accident waiting to happen. Langford parades him as if instinct is a substitute for knowledge. Mark my words, when he fails, it will be spectacular, and I'll be ready to prove it." The words chilled Daniel. He pressed himself against the wall, his fists clenched. He had never sought to humiliate anyone. He only wanted to listen to machines, to bring them to life. But now he saw. His gift had painted a target on his back. Even his father noticed the shift. One night, as they drove home in silence, the man finally spoke. "Daniel," his father said quietly, his voice rough from years behind a steering wheel, "do you understand what you're walking into?" Daniel stared out the window at the city lights. "I don't want trouble, Dad. I hear the machines. I can't stop." His father sighed, the sound heavy with both pride and fear. "I know, son. But these men, they've built their lives on being the smartest in the room. You make them look small, and small men with power are the most dangerous kind." Daniel's chest tightened. He wanted to promise his father he would be careful, that he would stay quiet. But he also knew it would be a lie. The fire inside him burned too brightly. Back in the lab, the rivalry deepened. Collins began to set traps, small, subtle ways to discredit him. He would alter a calibration, then step aside, waiting for Daniel to miss it. When Daniel caught the flaw, Collins would sneer, "So you think you know better than those who designed it?" Other times, Collins would bombard him with jargon-heavy questions, words meant to confuse. What's the vector mapping of the torque differential under variable load distribution? Daniel would hesitate, then answer in his own way. It leans too far left, like a man carrying a bucket of water with one arm. The engineers laughed under their breath, but Victor silenced them with a single look. The metaphor is clearer than your jargon, he said coldly. Still, the laughter lingered in the air, each chuckle a reminder that Daniel was not welcome. The boy endured it in silence, but at night, lying awake in the small room he shared with his father, he felt the weight of it pressing on him. He was walking a tightrope, between wonder and hostility, between the fire that pulled him forward and the fear that threatened to drag him down. One evening, Victor called him into his private study. The room was lined with bookshelves, leather-bound volumes stretching from floor to ceiling. The billionaire sat behind a vast mahogany desk, his sharp eyes glinting in the lamplight. "You know they don't like you," Victor said without preamble. Daniel's throat tightened. "Yes, sir." "And do you care?" Daniel hesitated. He thought of his father's worried eyes, of the whispers in the lab, of Collins's fury. Then he thought of the robot standing, walking, lifting under his guidance. "Yes," Daniel admitted softly. "I care, but not enough to stop." Victor leaned back, studying him. A faint smile touched his lips. "Good. If they liked you, I'd wonder if you were worth my time." Daniel blinked, startled. Victor's voice hardened. "Genius is never welcomed. It threatens the order of things. Remember this, boy. Rivalry is the shadow of recognition. If they fight you, it means they see you." The words struck deep. For the first time, Daniel realized that the hostility surrounding him was not proof of his weakness. It was proof of his power. Still, power made enemies, and enemies did not rest. Late one night, long after Daniel had left the lab, Collins lingered with his closest allies. They huddled around the dormant LX-9, their voices hushed but edged with venom. "He cannot keep outshining us," Collins whispered. "We'll make sure of it. Let him have his half-second guesses. When the real test comes, when the board sees, he'll crumble. And when he does, Langford will see the folly of trusting a child." The others nodded, their faces grim. The rivalry was no longer silent. It was sharpening into a weapon, forged in jealousy and fear. And though Daniel could not yet see the shape of it, he felt the shadow lengthening behind him. The day of the demonstration arrived with a tension that clung to the estate like mist. For weeks, rumors had swirled among the board members and investors of Langford Technologies. The abandoned LX-9 prototype, once considered a costly embarrassment, was suddenly stirring with life again. Whispers said it had taken steps. Whispers said it could lift, balance, even obey. But none of those whispers had mentioned the truth that burned hottest in the laboratory, that a boy, the chauffeur's son, had been the one to see what the engineers had missed. Victor Langford knew the power of spectacle. He had not risen to billions by showing the world polished perfection alone. He had risen by showing them resurrection. And so he called his board together, summoning them to witness what should have been impossible. Daniel awoke that morning with his stomach in knots. He dressed in the same worn shirt and sneakers he always wore, though his father begged him to at least tuck the shirt in. "You'll be standing in front of men who own half this city," his father said, his voice heavy with worry. "They won't be looking at me," Daniel whispered. "They'll be looking at the machine." But deep down, he wasn't so sure. When they arrived at the estate, the garage had been transformed into a stage. Rows of chairs had been arranged for the board. The LX-9 stood at the center, upright and gleaming under polished lights. Screens floated with data streams, the air thick with the hum of expectation. The engineers moved briskly, their coats starched, their faces set. Dr. Collins stalked among them like a general, barking last-minute orders, but his eyes kept darting toward Daniel. The boy felt the gaze like a thorn in his side. Victor entered last. His presence silenced the room. He wore a dark suit that gleamed under the lights, his silver hair immaculate. He walked to the front, his voice carrying effortlessly as he addressed the crowd. "Gentlemen, ladies, thank you for coming. You are here to witness not the future of this company, but the return of its promise. Months ago, this prototype was declared a failure. Tonight, I will show you that nothing is beyond redemption, if you have the right eyes to see it." His words stirred murmurs. Some board members leaned forward eagerly, others crossed their arms, skeptical. Investors were not sentimental. They were wolves who smelled only profit or loss. Victor gestured, and the demonstration began. The LX-9 powered on. Its sensors flickered to life. Slowly, deliberately, it stepped forward. One step, then another. Its balance held, its frame steady. Gasps rippled through the room. Collins seized the moment, raising his voice. "As you can see, after months of dedicated research, my team has restored the prototype's functionality. We have corrected torque issues, stabilized actuators, and refined sequence timing." Polite applause followed. Collins's face tightened into a proud smile. Daniel's chest constricted. He wanted to protest, to say the truth, that none of this had happened until he had touched the machine. But his father's hand rested on his shoulder, a silent plea. "Stay quiet. This is not your world." Then, suddenly, the machine faltered. It attempted to lift a small crate from the floor, but its grip slipped. The crate tumbled, clattering across the stage. Red warnings flashed across the display. The murmurs turned sharper. Skeptical eyes narrowed. Collins paled. "A minor calibration issue," he stammered. Victor's voice cut through the air like a blade. "Daniel!" The room froze. All eyes swung toward the boy. Daniel's breath caught. His father gripped his shoulder tighter, whispering urgently, "Stay back." But Victor's gaze held him like iron. "Come, show them." Daniel's legs felt weak as he stepped forward, the stares of powerful men searing into him. He knelt beside the crate, his small hands brushing the robot's fingers. He felt the imbalance, the strain of pressure unevenly distributed. "It isn't the calibration," he said softly, his voice carrying despite its quietness. "It's the rhythm. The grip engages before the balance is ready. If you shift the weight first, then lift, the crate won't slip." The engineers exchanged incredulous glances. One muttered, "Impossible guesswork." "Run it," Victor commanded. The sequence was adjusted. The robot bent again, slower this time. It shifted its frame, centered its balance, and then lifted. The crate rose smoothly, cradled firmly in its hands. Gasps filled the room, louder this time. Applause followed, scattered but growing. Victor's eyes gleamed as he addressed the board. "This boy saw what my team could not." His insight turned failure into motion. Remember this moment, not because of the machine, but because of what it means. Innovation does not bow to age, rank, or pedigree. Genius is where you least expect it. Daniel's cheeks burned. The applause was not for him, not really. It was for the machine, for the man who owned the machine, for the spectacle of resurrection. Yet he could feel the eyes on him, half in awe, half in suspicion. Collins stood stiff, his jaw clenched. He forced a smile, but his hands trembled as he applauded. Behind his glasses, his eyes burned with quiet fury. After the demonstration, the board members clustered in small groups, whispering. Some congratulated Victor, others pressed for details, their voices sharp with greed. Daniel slipped back into the shadows. but he could still hear their words. Remarkable, but unsustainable. A child, for God's sake. If this leaks, imagine the press. His father found him, placing a protective hand on his shoulder. "You shouldn't have been up there," he murmured. "This is dangerous, Daniel. You made enemies today." Daniel looked down at his hands, still faintly smudged with grease. "I didn't ask for this," he whispered. "I just wanted to fix what was broken." His father sighed, pulling him close. "Sometimes fixing things breaks other people." Meanwhile, in a corner of the room, Collins whispered to two allies. His voice was low, but venom dripped from every word. "He humiliated us in front of the board. If Langford continues parading this boy as some prodigy, we are finished. We need to act, quietly, permanently." The others nodded grimly. The rivalry was no longer hidden. It had stepped into the open, sharpened by public humiliation. And Daniel, though still trembling from the weight of so many eyes, felt it too. The fire inside him had been seen, undeniable now. But every flame draws shadows. The public test was over. The war in silence had begun. The demonstration had ended with thunderous applause. Investors shook Victor Langford's hand. Board members forced smiles, and the LX-9 prototype stood gleaming beneath the stage lights like a resurrected idol. But when the chairs were folded and the crowd dispersed, something darker lingered in the air. It began the next morning. Headlines leaked online, brief, tantalizing notes that stirred more questions than they answered. Langford Technologies stuns with prototype revival. Sources: Whisper, a child behind the breakthrough. The words spread like sparks in dry grass. By midday, the estate phone lines rang without rest. Journalists demanded interviews. Bloggers speculated. Anonymous posts mocked the idea. A chauffeur's son fixed what PhDs could not. Impossible. Others argued fiercely. Maybe genius hides in strange places. Who decides who belongs in science? Daniel, sitting at the small kitchen table with his father, stared at the glowing screen of an old borrowed phone. His name was not yet written, but it was circling closer. His chest tightened. "They know," he whispered. His father's face was pale, his jaw clenched. "This is what I feared, son. You can't hide from wolves once they smell blood." That evening, when Daniel returned to the lab, the air was different. The engineers barely looked at him. Conversations halted when he walked past. Collins, red-eyed and tight-lipped, stood before the LX-9 with an expression carved from stone. Victor entered late. He moved with his usual composure, but his eyes flicked sharply toward the glowing phones on the engineers' desks, toward the murmurs that ceased too quickly. He knew. "The press will not decide this story," he said coldly. "I will." But even Victor could not silence the tide. The backlash came swiftly. A prominent tech journal published an editorial. Langford endangers future by trusting folklore over science. On social media, a photo of Daniel, grainy, taken from outside the estate gates, circulated with cruel captions. Child labor at Langford Labs? Miracle Boy or Billionaire's puppet? Daniel saw it all, each word cut deep, though he pretended not to flinch. He had no armor against a world that judged by appearances before truths. The worst blow came from within. Late one night, after hours of calibration, Daniel returned to the garage to find his notes missing. The sketches he had made, scraps of diagrams, metaphors scrawled in pencil, were gone. In their place, a neatly folded sheet lay on the table. 3 words were written across it in bold, deliberate strokes. "Stay out. Now." Daniel's hands trembled as he held the paper. His father wanted to march straight to Victor, to demand protection. But Daniel shook his head. "No, Dad. If we tell him, They'll only hate me more. They already think I don't belong. I can't make it worse. Yet inside, fear gnawed at him. His gift, once afire, now felt like a target painted across his chest. Meanwhile, Collins sharpened his campaign. In hushed meetings with allies, he spread poison cloaked as reason. "The boy is a liability," he whispered. "If this reaches regulators, we'll be accused of exploiting a minor. If it reaches investors, they'll laugh us out of the room. Langford may think he's found a prodigy, but what he's found is a scandal waiting to break." One of his colleagues hesitated. "But the boy, he is right. He sees things we don't." Collins's eyes burned. "All the more reason to stop him. If a child proves us fools, what are we worth? Our reputations, our careers? They'll be rubble." And so the quiet war turned vicious. The next week, Daniel noticed changes. Systems he had once touched freely now locked him out. Tools disappeared from their places. Error logs he had corrected were rewritten to exclude his name. It was as if invisible hands were erasing him from the story. One night, as he adjusted a sensor on the LX-9, Collins leaned close, his voice low and venomous. "You think you're special, boy? You're nothing but a trick of luck. When this falls apart, and it will, you'll vanish, and no one will remember your name. Except us. We'll remember the trouble you caused." Daniel's throat tightened, but he met the man's glare. "I don't care if they remember me. I just want the machine to live." Collins sneered. "Machines don't live, and neither will your place here." But not everyone was blind. A few younger engineers began to watch Daniel with quiet respect, their skepticism bending toward belief. They saw what he saw, sometimes only after he named it. They didn't speak loudly, not yet, but their silence carried a new weight. Victor noticed, too. One evening he called Daniel to his study again. The boy sat small in the leather chair, the lamplight casting shadows across his face. "They are turning on you," Victor said without softness. Daniel looked down at his hands. "I know. And yet you come back." Daniel nodded faintly. "Because the machine needs me." Victor's eyes narrowed, studying him like an equation he could not quite solve. Then, slowly, he said, "They will try to erase you. They already are. But understand this, boy. Genius cannot be erased. Not truly. The world may laugh, it may strike, it may try to bury. But fire burns even under stone." The words steadied Daniel, though fear still lingered. He left the study with his chest heavy, caught between the comfort of being seen and the terror of being hunted. Outside the estate walls, the storm raged louder. Anonymous forums claimed the miracle boy was a fabrication. Others insisted Victor was exploiting a child to mask corporate desperation. Activists demanded investigations. Competitors sharpened their knives. And through it all, Daniel continued to enter the lab each night, to listen to the hum of circuits and the whispers of servos, to bring balance where chaos threatened. But now he knew. Each adjustment, each correction, each truth he spoke carried not just the weight of invention, it carried the weight of defiance. The backlash had come. And it was only the beginning. The storm of whispers had grown into thunder. Every day new articles appeared, each more sensational than the last. Some called Daniel a prodigy, others a fraud. Some accused Victor Langford of exploiting a child, others hailed him as a visionary who had found genius in the unlikeliest of places. For Daniel, the noise pressed on all sides. He no longer walked freely in the city with his father. He avoided the glances of strangers. He felt the weight of eyes everywhere, waiting to see if he would stumble. The backlash that had begun as murmurs in the lab now surrounded his very name. And yet, in the lab itself, the LX-9 walked. Day by day, it steadied, balanced, lifted, turned. What had once been considered scrap was now a marvel, and every motion bore traces of Daniel's touch. But Collins and his allies had not given up. One night, they presented Victor with a report, thick and bound, filled with charts, diagrams, and conclusions. Their voices were sharp, almost triumphant as they spoke. "Mr. Langford, this cannot continue. The boy's involvement risks scandal. Regulators will question safety. Investors will question credibility. If you continue parading him, they will not see a miracle. They will see recklessness." Victor listened, silent. His fingers drummed once against the desk. Then his eyes shifted toward Daniel, who sat small in a corner, hands clasped tightly in his lap. "Is that what you believe?" Victor asked quietly. Collins's voice was firm. "Yes. For the sake of this company, for the sake of our future, the boy must be removed." The silence that followed was unbearable. Daniel's chest tightened. He thought of his father's warnings, of the threats whispered in corridors, of the sheet of paper that had told him to stay out. Perhaps it was true. Perhaps he had no place here. But before he could speak, Victor rose. His presence filled the room, his voice sharp and commanding. "No!" The single word cut the air like a blade. The engineers froze. Collins blinked. "Sir." "No," Victor repeated, his voice rising. "You see a risk. I see the future. You see scandal. I see truth. You would erase him to preserve your pride. But I will not." He stepped forward, his gaze sweeping the room. "This boy has done what you could not. He has heard what you refused to hear. Machines do not bend to your titles or your degrees. They bend to those who listen, and he listens." Daniel's eyes widened. His throat tightened. He had never heard anyone speak for him like that, never with such certainty. Victor turned to him, his expression softer now. "Daniel, the world will try to erase you. They will call you fraud, accident, mistake. But genius cannot be erased. Fire burns even under stone. Do you understand?" Daniel nodded faintly, though tears pressed against his eyes. Victor faced the engineers once more. "If any of you cannot stand to work alongside him, leave now. I will not beg. But know this, history will not remember your excuses. It will remember his fire." The silence was crushing. None moved. Pride weighed heavy, but fear of Victor's wrath weighed heavier. And so it was done. A week later, Victor made the choice that stunned the world. At a press conference broadcast across networks, he unveiled the LX-9 prototype not as his company's triumph, but as a shared one. Cameras flashed, lights blazed, and the machine walked across the stage with steady steps. But it was not the robot that silenced the room. It was the boy who stood beside it. Victor placed a hand on Daniel's shoulder and spoke into the microphones. "Genius does not belong to privilege. It does not wear a uniform or a title or a suit. Genius can come from anywhere, even the son of a chauffeur who dared to listen to a broken machine when the world had turned away. Remember his name, Daniel. He will not be erased." The crowd erupted. Some clapped, some muttered, some shook their heads in disbelief. But no one could deny the spectacle. A boy, barely 13, had been lifted into the light of the world. Daniel's father stood at the edge of the stage, his cap in hand, his eyes filled with tears. He had wanted to protect his son, to shield him from the cruelty of power. But now he saw, perhaps this was his destiny all along. Afterward, when the lights dimmed and the crowd dispersed, Daniel stood alone with Victor in the quiet of the stage. "Why me?" Daniel whispered. "Why didn't you let them erase me?" Victor studied him for a long moment. Then, with uncharacteristic softness, he said, "Because once, long ago, I was you, and no one listened. I swore that if I ever found another, I would not make the world's mistake twice." Daniel's chest swelled with something he had never known fully before: belonging. The weeks that followed were not easy. The backlash did not vanish overnight. Some still mocked, others still doubted. But slowly, the tide began to turn. Schools invited him to speak. Young engineers reached out. Children from poor families wrote letters. "If you can, maybe I can too." Victor established a new initiative, an academy within the company, designed not for pedigreed graduates, but for children with untapped talent. Its doors opened not to resumes, but to curiosity. And at its heart, the first student was Daniel. The boy who had once crouched in a cold garage, fixing a discarded machine with bare hands, now stood as the beginning of something greater. He was no longer invisible. He was legacy. Thank you for staying with us until the very last moment of this story. Every view, every listen is a reminder that stories of courage and hidden genius still matter. If this tale touched you, we invite you to carry its light forward and share it with someone who needs to believe that even the unseen can change the world. Until we meet again, thank you for listening.